My grandmother played the piano. Her baby brother was Liberace. According to the people who heard my grandmother play more than once, she played at least as well as he did. I got to hear her play just a little bit briefly once. She didn't know I was there. For her, for reasons that were never discussed, playing the piano was as intensely private as her brother's playing was public. They were talented, but talent isn't what made them superb musicians. It allowed them to be as good as they got, and they worked very hard to get that good. To get and stay that good takes a lot of practice. That doesn't mean performing. It means doing things that are practicing. Things like playing the scales, things that hone key skills so that they could play well. Practicing and mastering pieces of music is on top of all that. A stage magician performs illusions and card tricks. Without practice, there is no illusion, there is no magic. With practice and mastery, there's wonder. How did that work? It's the practice that makes the magic. Athletes build up muscles and endurance and flexibilities in drills and exercises so that they can perform well. They practice. I'm sure that you have heard practice makes perfect, and I am not a fan of perfection. I am deeply suspicious of perfection. But that's a saying. And I think it is true for almost everything, because it is true about human beings. It is hard to do things that are unfamiliar. It takes work and attention to become good at something, and that is true of virtues as well. And we know this. If you have ever raised a child, you know how much time gets spent, has to be spent, teaching things like sharing, taking turns, playing nice, not hitting, saying please. Kids are trained, taught to become decent adults. It takes practice. It takes making it into habit. And if you look at some adults, I will not name names, if you look at some adults and wonder why they're not better people, maybe it's that they didn't get very good training as kids, or perhaps they never practiced much. Or maybe they did, and they were once good at it, but they stopped practicing. And like someone who used to be fluent in a language that they haven't used in years, they're rusty. My command of French is that way. It's been decades since I used it. We sometimes talk about how it feels when we take up skills after years and find it so hard. When I decided to pursue the ministry, which more accurately might be that the ministry decided to pursue me, which is a story I'll tell some other time, people kept telling me that I needed a reliable spiritual practice that would help me through difficult times. And I didn't ignore what I was being told, because I heard it from too many people who knew what they were talking about. But I felt like a fish being told it needed a bicycle. I needed what? I could point to things that people called spiritual practices, but I knew that those weren't what I wanted. I didn't and don't have a problem with the word spiritual, but I didn't want to just adopt any practice, particularly not a practice that was distinctly connected to a specific religious tradition that I didn't share. despite my deep appreciation of Buddhism. I wasn't inclined to take up Zazen. What I wanted was a spiritual practice, whatever that means, that didn't belong to another religious tradition, or better yet, a spiritual tradition that was distinctly Unitarian Universalist. And that seemed as likely as discovering a distinctly Unitarian Universalist religious holiday that I didn't already know about. I grew up Unitarian Universalist. Surely, if there were such a thing, I'd have heard of it. And then I discovered a class which was offered by the Reverend Rob Hardy's, then the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C. And the title of the course captured me: Unitarian Universalist Spiritual Practices. The universe has a perverse sense of humor, not one, but several. They exist. They're real. They are our heritage. Why we lost those traditions and don't remember them, no one really knows, but with very, very little adjustment, they're appropriate for pretty much any one of us, regardless of the labels that we apply to ourselves. Whether you understand yourselves as a Unitarian Universalist Christian, or a Unitarian Universalist humanist, or a Unitarian Universalist pagan, or Buddhist, or atheist, or something else, it doesn't matter. Even if you're really not sure what this word spiritual means to you. Now, I'm not going to try to teach them to you right here, right now, because I learned about them in a class that ran from 9 to 5 for a full week, and we'd really only gotten started. I cannot condense all of that in any meaningful way into just a few minutes here. I will, if people are interested, teach an introductory religious education class for those who are interested. We can do it on Zoom, we can do it in person. But what I'm telling you is that they exist, and why spiritual practices of some sort are important to us, to you, even if you're not sure what the word spiritual means, even if you're suspicious of the word. Some faiths have practices which are intended to improve one's relationship with God. Others seek to assist an individual towards enlightenment. There are Unitarian Universalists who use these practices for those reasons. That's fine. It's all fine. In our own history, there is a religious philosophy that was widely shared by many 19th century Unitarians and Universalists, particularly before the Civil War, but even into the 20th century, called self-culture. Its basic principles will seem very, very familiar to you because it was so widely adopted that it remains one of the most distinctive features of American society even today. It's just that it's been stripped of its religious and philosophical moorings, its contexts, and its values. How many of you, raise hands, how many of you have ever bought or been given, taken out of a library, a self-help book? Ubiquitous. They're everywhere, aren't they? There are whole sections in bookstores devoted to self-help. Behind all of them, the books and the programs and the lectures and the seminars and the retreats and the gurus, is a single driving idea. And every one of them shares this, and so do we. It's this: people, you, can be better. You can become better if we identify our flaws and our failings and work on them. That's the basis of self-help and of self-culture. Now, self-culture is an odd-sounding term to us. Today, we might assume that it's about making oneself more cultured. And that's not wrong. Not that our religious ancestors would have objected to it, but it's not what it means in that term. The culture they were thinking of is in words like agriculture. It's about tending to living things to create a beautiful, orderly, productive place, perhaps a garden. American Unitarians propose that this was the purpose or duty of humanity, to tend to the divine spark within us, to make ourselves and our lives as beautiful and productive and holy as possible. We were to be both the gardeners and the garden itself, thus self-culture. To become one's best self, to fulfill that divine vision of what we could be. Self-culture was rooted in our religious and moral values, the values of taking care of one's self, one's family, one's community, and all of humanity. Where we now speak today of building the beloved community, self-culture's adherents imagined it as something more organic. Rather than building the kingdom of God, they thought more in terms of growing it. The title of one of Emerson's best-known essays is Self-Culture, but today it's read and understood outside of the religious context that Emerson assumed and intended when he wrote it. And that's part of what happened to self-culture. It was adopted and co-opted and commoditized by the larger society, stripped of its name, its religious and moral moorings, and with troublesome notions such as being responsible to and for a community tossed overboard. It was then married to other ideas like social Darwinism, itself a bastardized understanding of evolution applied to human social interactions. And that gave us such persistent nonsense in the self-help movement as the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Bootstraps, if you're unfamiliar with them, are the loops that are sewn in at the back of your boots, the top of a shoe. They're there so that you can pull your boot on, to make it easier to put on that boot. Now imagine sitting and pulling yourself up off the floor or out of your seat by your bootstraps. It's impossible. It's absurd. So when someone says that they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and that others should, you know that they're babbling nonsense. Self-culture is an outlook and an attitude. At times, people have misunderstood it, even people practicing it, as a scheme to allow people to achieve perfection. The brutality and the carnage of the Civil War left many with a far dimmer view of humanity, finding the notion of onward and upward forever dubious, maybe absurd, and perhaps it is. World War I certainly fed that dim view of human possibility. Perhaps all of that and the death of so many who were practicing self-culture led to self-culture more or less vanishing. All we know is that the people who were practicing self-culture let it sputter out. We did not pass it along, and so we lost track of the traditions and the practices that made it up. Practices that those early Unitarians largely inherited from the Puritan standing order churches. Their deep roots. We come in part out of the Puritan tradition, and we retain many more Puritan attitudes than we'd care to admit. We've abandoned much of their worldview and theology. Certainly that's all just history, right? No. We still organize ourselves on models that the Puritans would recognize in a heartbeat. The Unitarians were heirs of those Puritans, and they shared a lot with them. Among those things were practices like prayer and meditation, journaling, reading both scriptures and other useful, uplifting books. They also got together on Thursday evenings to discuss important things, particularly ideas and issues that Sunday's sermon might have raised. Those people would slide right in here. They'd seem so familiar. Most of the objections we would have about their practices are about content, little dated, just as the Puritans had those kinds of concerns with the Church of England, and like the Unitarians had with their conservative brethren. The early Unitarians kept those familiar practices that their families had been using for generations, for centuries, and they adapted them. So what were the results? Well, those practices helped culture. People like Channing, Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker, to name just a few. Channing first defined what Unitarianism was for us in this country. We still read that sermon. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau wrote books and essays that are among the great classics of American literature and thought. Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, originally titled Resistance to Civil Government, was one of Gandhi's key inspirations. Margaret Fuller was perhaps the first proto-feminist, a woman widely held in the highest regard for her intellect, who sat at Emerson's table with him and Thoreau, and then, with some lack of humility, wrote in her diary, "I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own." Our people. Theodore Parker became a fiery crusader against slavery and other social ills. He co-created, took others, but created the first megachurch in America. Pre-Civil War, an integrated congregation of over 3,000 people attending his church in Boston. We name churches after these people. We remember who they were. And their spiritual practices were what made them into who they were. Thoreau's works are the result of his spiritual practices. So are Emerson's. Most of his essays are developed from the materials he mined from his diaries, which were the journal of his thought and spiritual practices. Those practices were the tools, the hoe, the rake, the watering can, the clippers of self-culture. And every one of these people, and so many others, was an active participant. Parker's practices grew him from being a near Calvinist biblical literalist to being so radical that even the Unitarian ministers of his day thought him a laudable Christian in practice, but not theology. He sought something that he called universal religion. He would fit right in today. There are many reasons for undertaking spiritual practices. A distinctly Unitarian Universalist reason is to become a better person. Broadly speaking, meditative traditions from Asia have focused on emptying the mind, becoming calm, while those in the West have done the opposite, seeking to focus and fill the mind with a specific target, idea, or intention. These seem utterly different, opposed, and yet both are forms of mindfulness. And there are other practices, other spiritual technologies. But broadly, I think we can call all of them devices that seek to help us to be calmer, more in control of our thoughts and feelings and behaviors, techniques for actively becoming better people. Our forebears knew that such things took time, took practice. To become better meant consciously becoming aware of one's failings and working to correct them. It meant practicing constantly to become the best people they could be. May we have such high goals, and may we too succeed at them. May it be so.